Today's episode is a long-awaited Doula Diary back by popular demand, and I am sharing about my last 4 births that I attended and how very different birth can be. And when you are well prepared, no matter what type of birth you're planning for, how they can still be empowering and positive experiences. All 4 of these clients were trained through Birth Story Academy, my online course. Anyone can take Birth Story Academy. It is medically accurate, as I wrote my book and my online course with the write-off of Dr. John Thorpe, who at the time was the director of obstetrics at Chapel Hill. So it's not just me, a doula, telling you how to give birth. It is all medically accurate information. And in Birth Story Academy, we plan for spontaneous labor, inductions, cesarean sections, how to care for your newborn, the stages of labor. There's actually 20 different classes within Birth Story Academy, and it's all self-paced. So you and your partner can each get your own login if you have a partner, someone to take the class with. And it also comes with corresponding workbooks and birth plan templates. So as you take your class on spontaneous labor, it comes with a spontaneous labor birth plan. Same for cesarean section and for inductions. So the first story that I share, I talk about how critical it was that even though my client was planning a home birth, that she had gone through Birth Story Academy and was prepared for what a hospital transfer might look like and what an induction or cesarean section might look like. But I don't want to give too much away. I just wanted to share with everyone as they're listening to birth stories, if you are pregnant, if you are trying to conceive, if you know someone else who is pregnant, there is a lot of powerful and empowering information in Birth Story Academy. After 22 years and attending over 1,000 births, I have literally taken every class I think that there is to take online or otherwise. And I do believe that I have written and recorded with the director of obstetrics from Chapel Hill the best online course to prepare you for birth, especially in a hospital, and to reduce your chances of having a cesarean section. All graduates of Birth Story Academy have experienced a less than 10% cesarean rate, less than 2 hours of pushing, and minimal tearing. Even those that went to the operating room have walked away with non-traumatic, positive birthing experiences. So today's Doula Diaries outlines 4 graduates of Birth Story Academy and their very unique stories: home birth, birth center, and hospital births. So let's get to it. What does a contraction feel like? How do I know if I'm in labor? And what does a day of labor look like? Wait, is this normal? Hey, I'm Heidi. My best friends call me Hides. I'm a certified birth doula, host of this podcast, and author of Birth Story, an interactive pregnancy guidebook. I have supported hundreds of women through their labor and deliveries, and I believe every one of them, and you, deserves a microphone and a stage. So here we are. Listen each week to get answers to these tough questions. Birth Story, where we talk about pregnancy, labor, deliveries, where we tell our stories and share our feelings. And of course, chat about our favorite baby products and motherhood. And because I'm passionate about birth outcomes, you will hear from some of the top experts in labor and delivery. Whether you are pregnant, trying desperately to get pregnant, or you just love a good birth story, I hope you will stick around and be part of this birth story family. Hey guys, it's been a hot minute since I've done a Doula Diaries, and that is because I have been busy. Last year and 2024, my work partner and I were doing about 6 to 8 births per month. also in 2023 and also in 2022. So we just really didn't have time to breathe or tell stories. So I actually had a crazy, last 10-ish days around the March 14th, 2025 blood moon. And it called all of my babies forth. So thankfully, no one's births ran into each other, but I had 5 births actually in a row. And today I was going to share about 4 of them and how different birth can be. So even after 22 years of being a doula to a lot of people, I continue to be surprised at every single birth that I attend, how differently they can unfold, how I still have never had 2 stories that even resembled one another, and how easy birth can be and how difficult birth can be. And so I just wanted to run down high level a couple of births, well, more than a couple, 4 birth stories for you guys today. And I will actually go in order. So the way that my week started was with one of my home birth clients, and it was a Saturday night and her water broke. And the night before, she had had an ultrasound and the baby was confirmed to be OP, occiput posterior, meaning the eyeballs were facing the pubic bone instead of the eyeballs facing the tailbone. Now, that's okay. Some pelvises are meant for a baby to come through OP. The more common way for a baby to rotate and come through is OA, occiput anterior, where the eyeballs are facing the tailbone and kind of the back runs along your side or belly button. So OP can just be a longer labor. It can take a while for a baby to rotate. We encourage baby to rotate with lots of different positions. And well, 2 of these stories are with OP babies, and 2 are not. So I will tell you, as a doula, there is a very specific shape to the belly also. So you'll see this very high, kind of lump above the belly button, and then it sort of kind of caves in. And it's a very unique looking belly. There's also a very different look for a breech baby, and an OA baby, it tends to be that nice, very, very round. There isn't that concave part around the belly button. So just really, really nice and round, with kind of a lower hanging head below the belly button. So it was really obvious that the baby was still OP on Saturday night because she was having back labor. So she called to let me know that her water broke, that she was in labor. Super chill, planning a home birth. No need to set the alarms off, let her midwife know. And the plan was, team, go back to bed. She'll let us know when she's in active labor. So she just labored on her own through the night, texted on and off. She was doing great. I should say this is a solo parent by choice who had done IVF. So she did have a friend, well, really a family member that was laboring with her. So on Sunday morning, everything sort of just died out, which is normal. Babies can just take their time, and your uterus conserves its energy, and the sun is up, and we're mammals. So Sunday, things sort of slowed down. We anticipated things would pick up Sunday night. Well, I was very surprised when I woke up on Monday morning and she slept all the way through the night on Sunday night without any contractions. So on Monday, which is now about 48 hours after her water's broken, which is still fine, no sign of infection or fever, she decided to do some castor oil. And I came over to help her do some spinning babies. I could tell the baby was still OP. So we did some inversions and some handstands and some shake the apples in the inversions and just tried to get the baby to come out of the pelvis to rotate and then kind of re-engage in a better position. And then she chugged some midwives brew, 2 ounces of castor oil, and mixed it with some nut butter and some juices. We blended it all up. And then I say plug and chug. She plugged her nose and had a straw and just chugged it down as fast as she could. And then I went home, and maybe a few hours later, usually castor oil kicks in 2 to 4 hours later. So within that time frame, she called me back and let me know she was having really close contractions that were actually long, 60 to 90 seconds long. So I said, okay, I'll come over and I'll labor with you. And I was like, hooray, it's Monday afternoon, we're laboring. By that evening, things were very intense. She started to have the urge to bear down around 8-ish p.m. and her team was assembled. So her midwife and our midwife's assistant came over, and we all just kind of helped her labor. She did such a beautiful job. I started to get the feeling when she started to bear down at the peak of contractions that the baby was still OP, which again can be fine. Many people push out their baby's OP. So she was really tired. I will say that. So she decided to take a Tylenol PM, which can be like a mini epidural, and lay down and sleep. But the urge to push, which is really the urge to bear down at the peak of the contractions, was just sort of overwhelming. So the way she was laboring was sort of like the head would come down, cause that reflex, and then the contraction would end and it would stop. But having been a labor doula for 22 years, I could tell that the sounds that she was making were not indicative of the fetal ejection reflex to push a baby out. This was just this urge to grunt and bear down. Some people get that urge from 4 centimeters on. She was declining vaginal exams. Again, home birth, very laid back environment. They filled up the tub, got her in the tub. She pushed a little in the tub while sleeping in between. And the hours just went by, specifically 8 hours until 4 o'clock in the morning. And then this poor mom was still having this urge to just bear down, but wasn't, really progressing. She actually consented to a vaginal exam and was like 9.75, meaning like her cervix was complete all the way around, except for at the very, around her pubic bone, like the anterior part of her cervix was still a little thick. And the midwife tried to reduce it, meaning hold it back while she pushed, and it wasn't going to give. So her cervix was just not ready. It was not necessarily the time to push, but we usually say your body doesn't hurt itself. So whatever your body's trying to do, just go with it. But after 8 hours, she was very, very, very tired. And so I brought her downstairs and put her in inversions and handstands for 45 minutes to just try to see, again, if the baby was still, I hate to say malpositioned, but I'm going to say it, malpositioned. And about 45 minutes of inversions, that urge to push or bear down went away. And her contractions just, slowed down. Her uterus was taking a break. It's all very normal. And I had been with her on and off for now 3 days. So, and going on 24 hours. So I needed to go home and take a nap. So I went home at 5:30 in the morning to take a nap. And about 9:30 in the morning, her family member called me and said, hey, can you come back over? She's on the toilet and she's shaking and she's vomiting and like wanting to push again. And for reasons that I will never understand, she was home alone. We won't go into that. So I said, I am 100% not comfortable as a doula and not someone who catches babies coming over to your home birth when you are shaking, vomiting, and pushing, kind of showing signs of transition after pushing for 8 hours last night, if there are not medical people there. But I am happy to meet you at the hospital if you would like to transfer, or I'd be happy to come to you later. It was really difficult for me, you guys, to put that boundary in place. But my client at this time, she's now 4 days into her labor. Her water's been ruptured for 4 days. She's very tired. And she felt like transferring to the hospital and compassionate and wise use of an intervention like an epidural would help her get rest so that she could get through the rest of this labor. It's very hard when you're planning a home birth to make the decision to transfer and to utilize an epidural. But after 4 days, she was wiped, and she knew that this could be the way to love and be compassionate to herself, is to get an epidural and just take a nice long rest. So we meet at the hospital. She's still the same. She's 9.75. She has this anterior lip, and she's confirmed to be still OP, or the baby is still OP, which makes sense, like why the baby isn't or hasn't rotated yet to move down into the pelvis. Now, I deeply believe in your body. I deeply believe in your baby's ability to navigate your pelvis. You just have to have extreme patience and pain tolerance to go more than 4 days, okay? I do believe that eventually this baby could have rotated with proper time and rest and positioning, but we were running out of time because of being 4 days ruptured and the risk of getting an infection, chorioamnionitis. So she got an epidural. She was so happy. It was the best epidural ever. She literally, if I said flip over on your hands and knees, she could do it on her own. She was able to do inversions, hands and knees. We did all of the positions of spinning babies, exaggerated side lying releases, runners, lunges. I mean, she just had full mobility with this epidural, but felt absolutely no pain. And she was able to take full, deep, snoring naps. It was magical for her. And she labored for another 12 hours like that. And eventually she started to get a fever. And the midwife went to do just the second vaginal exam. So this would have been only 4 vaginal exams total. So 2 vaginal exams at home with the home birth midwife and 2 vaginal exams at the hospital with the hospital midwife. So very limited vaginal exams. And she was the same, still the anterior lip, regardless of our best efforts to pop the baby out of the pelvis, rotate the baby from OP to OA. The anterior lip was still there. But the good news is the midwife said, baby is now OA. Like, I can feel the fontanelles on the top of the head, and we can tell that the baby's rotate. The shape of her belly looked different. And we were like, yes, this baby is rotating. This is happening. This is really exciting. We just need to give it more time and patience for that anterior lip to resolve. We even tried a position Walters, which can reduce the anterior lip. So we decided to give it, she had an infection now, chorioamnionitis, but we were like, let's give it an hour. One of my old doula partners is now a midwifery student and a registered nurse. And so she came in and was like, fresh energy, because at this point I'm really dying, you guys. It's like day 4 and I've only slept for maybe 3.5 hours. And so was this mother giving birth, and so was her family member. I mean, it was just a disaster of fatigue. So thankfully, this amazing nurse comes on shift for night, and she's like, Heidi, why don't y'all all lay down and take a nap and let me do some of the spinning babies positions So she steps in, she does Walters with the midwife. They do a couple more inversions, and the anterior lip resolves. She's 10 centimeters dilated, but again, has this infection. The midwife said that her vagina felt very, very warm. So anticipating at this point that the baby was also probably sick from the infection. The baby's heart rate was quite high, tachycardia, which is a sign of chorioamnionitis. But they were like, you know what? Everybody's healthy and looks good. Let's just push and see. So we pushed in every position, hands and knees, runner's lunge, squats, on her side, on her back, all the things. And the baby just wasn't moving. And like, again, you guys, she had full feeling. I mean, she could tell when the contraction was coming. She knew when and how to push without being coached. She just didn't feel any of the pain of it. And after a couple of hours, the midwife came in and just said, like, your fever is going up. Your, vagina is getting much hotter in there. You have not moved the baby any lower in 2 hours of pushing, even with, it's not like she's laying on her back with her legs wide, y'all. Come on. If you listen to this podcast, I would never let that happen. So, I mean, we were legit pushing in like every knees in, ankles out. We did everything, and that baby didn't budge. So, planned home birth is now having to make the decision to keep going or to end a 4-day labor at around midnight. This is now Tuesday at midnight going into Wednesday. Again, this story started on Saturday night with her water breaking. And she made the very difficult decision, especially as a solo parent without someone at home to help her recover from a cesarean section. She made the decision to go to the operating room and to have a cesarean section. And for her, that was an empowering choice because she felt like we did everything. And she didn't want to keep going now that there was this infection and this fever with both of them. So we went to the operating room. We had they were so kind. I mean, the obstetrician could not have been more compassionate and loving. And the midwife, they just all sat around her and said, we know you wanted a home birth. How can we make this cesarean special for you? And she said, I just wanted a lotus birth. And a lotus birth is where you don't cut the cord either at all or until the placenta is delivered. And she said, I just want to see the baby connected to the placenta, and please don't cut and clamp the cord. And the obstetrician said, you know what? I have never done this in an operating room, but I'm willing to try. So if your bleeding is good, if the baby is good, we will give you that lotus birth. She had several other wishes. I will say, shameless shout out over here. All of my private doula clients take my online course, Birth Story Academy. Now, that is available at birthstory.com to anybody who wants to take it. 6 hours, 20 modules. You do an entire class on prepping for a C-section, an entire class on prepping for an induction, an entire class on prepping for spontaneous labor, and then, 17 other classes within this. I did write all of my content and was approved with the director of obstetrics from Chapel Hill at the time, Dr. John Thorpe. So everything is medically accurate. There is a less than 10% cesarean rate with everyone who takes and graduates from Birth Story Academy. So there's my shameless plug, because while she was a planned home birth, thank God she took Birth Story Academy, and we had a cesarean birth plan just in case. And it was a family-centered, mother-centered, gentle cesarean birth plan. And because it wasn't an emergency, we were able to go through her birth preferences. So every single thing that she wanted to have in her cesarean section was seen through. And It was beautiful. We were all crying. The baby was healthy and they were able to do a lotus birth. So I do not have permission to share these photos, but I just want to tell you how beautiful it is to see a baby and the placenta be born together in the operating room and to not be separated, so that the mom who was giving birth still had that chance to see the placenta and the baby connected, which was something that was really important to her. So I honor the midwife and the obstetrician and the entire OR staff for giving that gift to this mom. Oh, I'm getting emotional as I say it. So there's story number one. That's how I kick off my week, with a 4.5 day long labor and birth that starts out as a planned home birth and ends in a cesarean section. And that was really hard, but I will say that she felt loved and supported and empowered the whole time, even if it was the last story that she was expecting. And she was prepared, right? Like, she planned for a home birth, but she still took Birth Story Academy so that she would be prepared for what it might look like if things took a turn. And it did. So then I went home and I was like, I'm not the most religious person in the world, but I was like, God, save me. Like, I need sleep. Redeem my faith in birth, because that was a really hard one. And some of them, like I said, are really easy and some are really hard. And I'll never know what makes one birth long and arduous and challenging and then one really short. So the next one was a birth center client. So again, planned unmedicated, wanted to labor at home as long as possible. And her surges, she was doing hypnobirthing. So her surges is what we call, or waves instead of contractions, began in the middle of the night. And she just kept me asleep, but texted through the night. And they were short, but they were intense. So 30 or 40 seconds long, meaning not active labor, but labor. We would also in hypnobirthing say it was her birthing time. So her birthing time had begun. It was still very early, but intense. She got in the bath. She moved around. She got on her ball. She let her partner sleep. And in the morning, we talked and connected, and we did a FaceTime call, and the surges were about 6 to 9 minutes apart. And this is where it's very hard as a doula, because you just want to race over and like rescue someone. But the job of a doula is not to rescue. The job of a doula is to empower and encourage and to let people go through the portal themselves. And so I reminded her I would be with her when the surges were very close together and very long and very intense. But right now she was getting these long breaks, 6 to 9 minutes. And so that she should try to go to sleep and rest, even though that feels impossible. So that's exactly what she did. She was able to sleep in and out of consciousness for several hours. She called me around noon, or maybe at this point her partner called me around noon and said, things are getting really intense. We're ready to go to the birth center. She was kind of shaking. She was crying, which is a normal release. Those labor shakes can just be really intense. She had vomited and was having a lot of just pressure in her vagina. So I said, okay, let's meet at the birth center. So we meet at the birth center, and her birthing labor is very intense. And the birth center requires a vaginal exam usually to make sure that you're in labor and that you can stay there. You have to be 6 centimeters dilated. So her exam showed that she was 4 centimeters dilated, but she was 90% effaced, which is so thin. That is a paper thin cervix and a 0 station. So baby was really low. So myself and the midwife, we sort of convened outside the room, and she said, well, I'm going to let her stay for 4 hours to see if she gets into a more active labor pattern. And I was like, girl, between me and you, she's about to have this baby. And the midwife was like, I know, and I was like, let's just see what we can do. So we labored so hard. I mean, she was so strong. We labored on the toilet. We labored in the shower. She put a little knee pad down and was leaning over the birth ball, rocking back and forth with the hot water pouring over her back. I was massaging her back and squeezing her hips, and she didn't want to move, but I just said, we've got to keep moving, because I didn't want her to have to go home. I wanted her to progress past 6 centimeters, as quickly as possible, because it's devastating when the birth center sends you home. So when I would feel her vibrations, like just rubbing her back and squeezing her hips, I could just tell it was very, very, very intense. Her water was still intact. And suddenly she became very vocal, primal, roaring, grunting at the peak of contractions. And I was like, oh, wow. I mean, we're like 7 to 9 centimeters. It's very obvious to tell when you have been an experienced birth worker without doing a vaginal exam. So I went out and talked to the midwives and, the midwife and the nurse, and they said, oh yeah, we can hear her. And I said, I don't think you need to check her again. I think she's clearly in transition. We're getting closer to pushing. And they said, we agree. There's no reason to check again. I said, I think you might want to fill up the tub. She wanted to give birth in the tub, the birthing tub that goes in the suite at the birth center. So the midwife and the nurse came in to fill up the tub, and we continued to labor. I brought her back to the toilet, and she was so mad at me because she had been laying in bed resting at this point. And I was like, you just got to trust me, girl. Get up. I was like, come on, I'm going to help you. And she went back over to the toilet. And while she was on the toilet, she was like, oh gosh, you guys, like I just felt the baby drop down. Like that was crazy. She was in between a surge, and she was like, it's also really weird when the surge ends. She's like, I don't even feel pregnant. She was like, I feel totally fine. And then the next surge hit, and she's roaring and moaning and grunting and bearing down. So we move her over to the birth tub, and the midwife does check her just to make sure she's close. And she was about 8 to 9 centimeters dilated, but her bag of water was bulging. Baby was very low, like a +1 station. And so the midwife offered to break her water in the water. And she consented because the midwife said this will make it go faster, but you don't have to do this at all. And she said, oh no, let's make this go by faster. So she did that. And as soon as her water broke, she was 10 centimeters dilated. She started pushing from the start of the contraction to the end of the contraction. And I'm trying to think like what happened next, but I don't want to just say, and then she gave birth, but she did. So she moved over to her hands and knees. And she said she just didn't feel like she was moving the baby with the pushes. So I just said, your body will tell you what to do, which leg. Pick a leg and put your leg up in runner's lunge. So your pelvis is a little bit slanted or tilted and asymmetrical. And immediately she throws up her left leg. So I'm like, okay. And she says, on the next push, she said, ooh, I felt the baby drop down lower. And then we pushed a couple times in that position. And she said, I don't feel like I'm moving the baby again. And I said, okay, put your leg down again. And she put her leg down. She put the other one up. She said, oh, I felt the baby move down again. And the midwife was like, oh yeah, we're getting close to crowning. And she said, I think it will feel good if I just put both legs up and kind of tilt my knees in, put my knees in, ankles out, but like in a Buddha squat. And so she got up in that position, and she was holding on to her partner. So she's in the tub, her partner's outside of the tub. And just 2 or 3 pushes later, the baby emerges into the water. It was so beautiful. She sat back and she brought her daughter up to her chest, and they just had this magical moment in this warm water, just still connected, placenta still inside. And it was 4:30 in the afternoon. So you have to remember she called me at noon. So I had just come off this 4-day long birth. And then I have this beautiful, no birth is easy, but this mom will tell you, she was like, it just really wasn't that bad. And it was very fast. And I remember looking at her and going, I can't believe I'm going to go home and have dinner with my family tonight. Like, I'm so confused. I usually don't leave for a birth at noon and then make it home for dinner. So I go home and I sleep. And then my next client has gestational hypertension at 41 weeks gestation and goes in for a routine appointment. Her blood pressure is like skyrocketed and she needs to be induced to keep her and her baby safe. So they check into the hospital at like 5 p.m. This is like the next day, but I've had a full night's sleep, so it's great. Her cervix is thick, closed, posterior. Like her body was saying, nope, not ready. So she probably would have gestated to 42 or plus weeks if she didn't have gestational hypertension. And they did cervical ripening with 4 doses of Cytotec through the night. Once her cervix was open a little bit, they placed a Foley balloon. She had taken castor oil before going into the hospital for the induction. She did do the midwives brew. So when she did the midwives brew, she had very long, strong contractions. But castor oil has a half-life. It kind of fades into the background after about 6 or 8 hours. And when those contractions died and she was on Cytotec, she just felt mild cramping. When she got the balloon, the Foley catheter, which is a balloon on the top and bottom part of the cervix, inside and outside, it helps release prostaglandins. It helps dilate the cervix. Again, she barely felt anything, just some cramping. Then the balloon was removed at about 7 or 8 hours. It can stay in up to 12 hours, but they went ahead and removed it at 7 or 8 hours, and they started Pitocin. And guess what? She feels nothing. So she's on Pitocin for like a day and feels nothing. So I go the next morning, it's like 8 o'clock in the morning, and I go to like just check on them and hang out with them. And at that time that we were all checking in, the midwife came in and said, okay, it's been a couple of days. We've done some cervical ripening. You still haven't had contractions even on Pitocin. We think we should break your water and see what that does. So they break her water and voila, she starts having contractions. So we labor. Her plan is unmedicated. So at this point, it's just AROM, and I think she's not on any Pitocin. So we're just labor. And at some point, she just looks at me and says, Heidi, I know I wanted to have an unmedicated birth, but like, listen, we're on day, whatever it is, 4 now. And I was like, I know. And she was like, don't talk me out of it. I just want an epidural. And I was like, listen, I'm not going to talk you out of it. We're fine over here. So we get her an epidural and her contractions just die, which sometimes that happens. Sometimes an epidural speeds everything up and sometimes it changes nothing at all. And sometimes the contractions die a slow death. So they died a slow death. And so they added Pitocin. And next thing you know, we're on max dose Pitocin for this hospital, which is 20. And in order to go to 30, they place an IUPC, an intrauterine pressure catheter, to measure the strength of contractions. So they've gone a little bit up at this point to 22. But the OB and the midwife are really like, in order to go much higher than that, we would really need to place an IUPC and track the strength of contractions through this algorithm that they use, which is monitoring the pressure units and things called MVUs. Now, data suggests to have cervical change, MVUs need to be somewhere between like 180 and 220. So sometimes you'll put an IUPC in and people's MVUs are 250 and you're like, gosh, why aren't they having cervical change? And sometimes you put an IUPC in and you find out MVUs are 50 and you're like, oh, no wonder the cervix isn't changing. The person's like barely contracting. So in this story, that's what was happening. They just didn't feel comfortable going to the max dose of Pitocin, which would have been 30 for this hospital. So they stayed on 22. They did an IUPC and MVUs were 50. So she had gotten to maybe 7 centimeters dilated. And then all of a sudden, after taking a nap and being on this high dose Pitocin, her cervix and her labias and her outer vulva had all swollen, and her cervix was now 5 centimeters dilated. So everything was regressing. When everything starts to swell, it is typically due to, and again, I hate this word, but I don't know what else to say, like malpositioned baby or not optimally positioned for the shape of the pelvis. So again, some babies come out perfectly OA and some come out perfectly OP. So one reason for PASMO, which is the Spanish word for regressing cervix, we don't have an English equivalent word for that. But when the cervix is regressing, when PASMO is occurring, when the tissue is starting to swell, it typically means that the pressure is not even. And things that you can do. Some people will take a Benadryl to kind of reduce the tissue swelling and to get the pressure off of the cervix. So to do some inversions, get on hands and knees with your chest down and your butt in the air, just maybe even in the bed, like she had an epidural. So in the bed, putting the bottom of the bed all the way down so that that chest down, butt up is even more exaggerated, like a half handstand. So at this point, we had some choices to make. Just sleep and rest and take Benadryl and or do some inversions and increase the amount of Pitocin to see if those contractions would get stronger or to adequate MVUs, because at 50, her uterus was just like, that's your uterus saying like, I'm done. Like the uterus was like barely contracting. So here I am as a doula and I'm like, okay, I had this like really long, rough home birth where the fetal positioning and the opening of the cervix and the pushing was quite challenging. Then I have this, to me as a birth worker, hard. To me as a birth worker, easy. No, this person who gave birth at the birth center, she would never say that that was an easy birth. But from the birth worker perspective, a relatively uncomplicated, spontaneous, physiological birth where everything unfolds in a routine manner in a perfectly positioned baby. Now, back to gestational hypertension, controlled at the hospital, and the uterus just not wanting to contract. Unsure of baby's positioning because cervix was now swollen in 5 centimeters. So the midwife couldn't even get to fontanelles. The baby was still so high, we were guessing. Now, when you're guessing on fetal positioning, you can do a bedside ultrasound to check, but we just weren't even there yet because labor hadn't progressed enough. So the parents decided to sleep for 2 hours. They were just tired. They didn't feel like they could make an unemotional decision. And I'm trying to think what I did. I think I just like went downstairs to the cafeteria and ate some sushi. And then there's like this beautiful patio on the rooftop. And I sat out on the patio and I talked to my kids. And eventually they woke up around 8 or 9 p.m. and it said, "Hey, Heidi, we're ready for you." We brought the team back in and the midwife was willing to do another vaginal exam after her just like deeply resting, and everything was still very swollen. And now the cervix was not just 5 centimeters because it was soft. Now the cervix was swollen and also hard. So her cervix was saying, no, thank you. And we gave them some time alone. And in the end, while everyone was still healthy and heart rates were healthy, they deemed it labor arrest. The midwife also said that the baby did feel quite big for this particular mom, who was very small, like 5 feet tall, and that the bottom of the vaginal canal felt very tight. And the midwife, who's very conservative with cesarean sections, like she does not call, or not, she doesn't call the cesarean, but she doesn't recommend a cesarean section unless it is like she does not see another way forward. And so I really trust her. And so when she said, like, I think the best way through this is a cesarean section, I'm in full trust of this midwife because we work together a lot. And I know that she doesn't say that very often. So we gave the parents some time alone, and they decided to have a cesarean section. And I think what was really hard for me in the cesarean section is that the baby was perfectly positioned. The baby was OA, occiput anterior facing down, but the head was so molded in this like long cone head with a giant ring where the opening of her pelvis was. I want to say that a baby could fit out of anyone's pelvis, that your body makes the perfect size baby for your body. But this baby's head was very, very big for this mom's pelvis. And I'm just not sure that, in my experience, seeing the ring of molding and then how wide the rest of the head was, I'm just not sure that that head would have moved through the pelvis without damage. So, everyone in the room concluded after seeing the presentation of the baby being a perfect presentation and the head just sort of being molded and really stuck, even though we were moving the pelvis tremendously, and the cervix just closing shut and getting harder. That head was a 38 centimeter circumference. That was one of the I think that is the largest head I've ever had on record. And she's, a teeny tiny little 5 foot tall person. So it was really a hard induction. It was very long. It was very emotional. And in the end, I think they made the right call. And as a birth worker, that's hard. So anytime your client plans a doula assisted, unmedicated, spontaneous labor birth and ends up in an induction in a cesarean section, things kind of went sideways. So I go home and I go to sleep, and it's like at this point, we're like on this big blood moon in the fullness. And I wake up in the morning to a phone call about 5 a.m. And mind you, I don't have any clients due until 2 or 3 weeks. I have a home birth at the end of March, and then I have my next client due in the middle of April. So I'm ready to sleep for weeks, you guys. So when my phone rings at 5 in the morning, I'm super confused, especially by it's the father of the client who's not due for 5 more weeks, 35 weeks gestation. And her water broke in the middle of the night, and she started having contractions right away. They actually decided to keep me asleep because they just were going to the hospital in triage, not in active labor, to get checked out. And they were going to call me when they were more in active labor. So they called at 5 o'clock in the morning. Contractions were 4 to 5 minutes apart. Her cervix was 4 centimeters dilated upon admission. Baby was still kind of high, and she hadn't been assigned a room yet. And I was sort of in shock. I was like, oh, wow, you're the last person I was expecting to hear from. But birth is so unpredictable. Birth work is unpredictable. Being on call 24/7, 365 is just sort of a wild life, you guys. I just say I just need a t-shirt all the time when anyone says, you want to go on a date? You want to go out to dinner? You want to hang out with your friends? You want to go on vacation? My answer is always, well, yeah, unless I'm at a birth, because I don't know if you're giving birth at 27 weeks, 33 weeks, 35 weeks, or 43 weeks. Who knows? So 35 weeks, water breaks. I told him, I said, well, it sounds like she's in labor, clearly, but it doesn't sound like she's in active labor. Let me go back to bed for a couple hours. When the nurse says that she's in active labor, 2 to 3 minutes apart, 60 to 90 seconds, it probably won't be much longer. Let me know, and I will come meet you at the hospital, and we will labor, because typically first labors are quite long. And a few hours later, about 8 a.m., the husband calls me back and he says, okay, the nurse says we're 2 to 3 minutes apart, 60 to 90 seconds. She's having to kind of breathe through them and focus. And I think it's time for you to come up here. And I said, okay, great. I'm actually on my way. I was driving just to check on them anyway. So about 10 minutes later, I was in room, and sometimes just your doula coming into the room changes everything. It's like, oh, your whole team is assembled, your body relaxes. Things ramped up very quickly, and she was a planned medicated birth. When I got there, she was utilizing nitrous oxide, and it just didn't seem to be working that well for her anymore. And she wasn't at the point of no return, but I just said, hey, if you're planning an epidural, I think now is the time. I had been there less than 5 minutes. I had seen 2 contractions, and I was like, this is going quite quickly. I think we should start bolusing your fluids to move you towards an epidural if that's your plan. So we started getting her fluids, and we were just, doing some circuits, some movement, some stretches, some squats, walking around the room, rocking back and forth, double hip squeezes. I had her do these side lunges where she puts one knee up and then I do a double hip squeeze. And whoa, things started to progress really quickly. She said she could feel the baby drop down, and we're still waiting for the fluids to bolus. And she's like, at this point, deep in transition. So she's only had that one vaginal exam where she was 4 centimeters dilated. And I was like looking at her husband like, oh my God, this is going very fast. She's clearly in transition. Then she starts to push. She lays down on her side and she starts to push, and she's sucking on the nitrous oxide. And I go out, I just leave her in the middle of the contraction with her husband. And I go out to the nurse's station and I find the nurse, and I was like, so she's pushing. I'm like, how far away is the anesthesiologist? And the obstetrician comes in, and we're waiting on anesthesia, and anesthesia then walks in the door, and the nurse comes in, and they check her cervix, and she is 10 centimeters dilated, but she's like 0 + 1 station. So the baby's still a little bit high in the pelvis. And I said, do we have time for this epidural? Like, she really wants an epidural. I said to the OB, can you check her while she's pushing for 1 contraction? And if she's moving that baby really quickly versus you think we've got some pushing ahead of us, could you let us know? So the next surge starts. The obstetrician, with consent, inserts her fingers to the head, feels her power through the contraction, and says she is moving the baby, but this baby is not going to fly out of her. I think we have at least an hour of pushing. We can get an epidural. So anesthesiology is already in the room. It took less than 3 contractions to get her epidural. Within 15 minutes, the urge to push is gone. She doesn't feel anything. And we just sort of put her in a position in which to slow the labor down. She just wanted a chance to get numb, to catch her breath, and then take a nap so that she could be powerful for pushing. So we're like, let's just let your uterus do what your uterus wants to do and not push on top of your uterus. And then we'll start pushing again after you're rested. And she was able to rest for, I don't even know, more than 2 hours, 2 to 3 hours at 10 centimeters dilated. And then the head just got lower and lower. And then all of a sudden the head was +2 and she started to feel something again. Like, so she went from being completely numb to being like, oh, you guys, I've got this like stitch in my right hip. And I'm like, oh, that's not a stitch in your right hip. Like, that's a baby's head, much lower. Like, let me remind you that you are completely dilated and you were pushing 2 hours ago. So the obstetrician came in and she pushed on her left side, her hands and knees, runner's lunge, her other side, and then we moved to her back where she actually said she felt the most power. But the back, we moved the baby down by pushing on her hands and knees, runner's lunge, and her sides. And then we moved to her back for the delivery. We had tried tug of war, the squat bar. So she did end up pushing for 2 hours, but most of that pushing was done in positions to open and move her pelvis. It was really interesting to me because she was 35 weeks along. So I'm assuming, small baby, small head. You can't assume anything in birth, you guys. So this 35-week baby comes out and is 7 pounds with a huge head. So the baby is considered late preterm because it 35 weeks and 6 days. So anything between like 35 and 37 weeks is considered late preterm versus anything before that is preterm delivery. So she had no tearing, and I would like to contribute that to the work that she did with pelvic floor therapy and appropriate perineal stretching with the guidance of her pelvic floor therapist. And she just had a beautiful birth. And then I came home again and was like, please God, I just have to go to bed for a few days. So it is now March 26th when I'm recording this, and I have had a full week's worth of sleep, and it's been glorious. Thank you, universe. And now I am awaiting just the home birth that is due at the end of March. So those were my 4 births in a row over the blood moon, which these big, full, powerful moons, oh my gosh, they call the babies out, even the 35-weekers. And birth workers don't get any sleep. If you are a birth worker and you are listening to this episode, I would love for you to DM me and let me know how your March 2025 blood moon went for you. But I recorded this Doula Diary today because it was such a unique reminder to me how birth is unpredictable, gestation is unpredictable, length of labor, how hard, how long, fetal positioning. No 2 births are the same. I went from very difficult to very easy. Very difficult to very easy. Again, I'm speaking from a birth worker's perspective. This was very difficult for every single person that was giving birth, no matter how long or how short, or vaginal birth or cesarean section. So all 4 walked away from their births in a pretty positive place. Now, those that ended in cesarean section, they're disappointed, right? But I would not say that I don't believe I've done their postnatal visits already. I don't think they're traumatized. I think they're grieving. I think they're sad. I think they're hopeful that they can have a VBAC in the future. And I think both of them deeply understand after their babies were born that they were medically necessary cesarean sections to keep them and their baby safe. So if you have any questions for me ever as you're listening to Doula Diaries or the birth stories, you can always DM me on Instagram. I'm at birth.story.academy. And I love sharing birth stories with you and sharing my own personal experiences. And I hope that you learned something from Doula Diaries today. Peace to you and your family. Be well.
Thank you for listening to Birth Story. My goal is you will walk away from each episode with a clear picture of how labor and delivery might go, and that you will feel empowered by the end of your pregnancy to speak up, plan and prepare for the birth you want, no matter what that looks like.